Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comet Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. I'm delighted today to welcome Mindy Belz as our guest at Conversing. Mindy is a journalist who has covered wars and victims of conflict in Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Sudan, and the Balkans. She recounts some of the tremendously painful and difficult military, health, and economic challenges around the world. Her work appears in the Wall Street Journal, the Plough Quarterly, and other publications. The New York Times calls her, quote, one of the bravest and best foreign correspondents in the country. Today, as we welcome Mindy, we do so acknowledging that we're facing one particular devastating decision of the new administration, which is the end of PEPFAR, the best response that the world has made to the devastating global HIV/AIDS crisis. She's written a recent article that she posted in her Substack, which is in the notes. It's an article that simply highlights the history of PEPFAR and its incredibly positive, life-giving, life-sustaining impact, not just in the past, but still currently. It's this that we're going to be focusing on in our conversation today. Mindy, welcome to Conversing. We're so glad that you're here.
Thanks, Mark. Same.
You know, I'd like to start with just a bit of your personal story. How did you get into journalism? How did you get into globally focused journalism? And what are some of the things that have been significant in your own faith in relationship to that vast and literally continuously and unending set of challenges?
Yeah. Well, it was about 30 years ago, so it's a long story, but I'll try to make it short. I mean, initially I got started writing for World Magazine, I often say, because my brother-in-law started the magazine and he was desperate. And he had me doing some writing. I had a background on Capitol Hill. I had studied international relations at George Washington University. So I just kept moving from one thing to the next. And suddenly there I am covering the 10th anniversary of Chernobyl's meltdown in Belarus and Ukraine. And it just kind of went on from there. And I did do in the 90s, I was doing a lot of reporting, the late 90s in Africa. And so, you know, was seeing everywhere, absolutely everywhere you went, the effects of the AIDS pandemic. And I talk in the piece that I just wrote about you could not go into a hospital without seeing that it was overflowing with people who were dying of AIDS. And there was a hospital in downtown Nairobi where you would walk down the hall and you would thread your way past some of those victims. And there was very little that could be done for them at that stage. So I did a lot of reporting. I was there to cover conflict. I covered the conflict in Sudan, was in and out of Nairobi and Uganda quite a bit throughout East Africa. But then 9/11 changed everything. And I had obviously, by covering the war in Sudan, I was seeing a lot of the conflict between Christians and Muslims, if we want to put it in those kind of black and white terms, which that was very much a prominent feature of that civil war at the time. And also seeing the rise of Islamic extremism. I passed by one of the al-Qaeda camps at one point that was operating then in Sudan before they moved to Afghanistan. And so it felt like we were all talking a lot. Someone gave me a biography of Osama bin Laden on one of my last, I think it was an early 2001 trip I made to Sudan. And 9/11 came, we had a war in Afghanistan. I began going to the Middle East more, and soon I was just going to Iraq over and over again and watching learning so much.
Right.
I just, you're always an apprentice to this process.
Right. Yes.
And discovering Christian communities I did not know existed in the heart of the Muslim world, watching those communities be forced to flee their homes over and over again until we came up to 2014 and you had the rise of ISIS, and they took over a third of Iraq and much of Syria. And so I found myself going from, initially getting into Iraq by crossing the Tigris River from Syria. And then suddenly I'm going to Iraq and crossing the Tigris River to get into Syria as that war also began to just continue and become so tragic for so many communities there. And I think that, Mark, I learned early on something that, I learned two things that I think were really unique and have kind of driven my reporting. I was often entering a man's world. I was often walking into one of the biggest faux pas I made was walking into a room and very American-like sticking out my hand to shake the hand of a local sheikh. And that was the wrong thing to do. And I had to learn the rules of the road. I had to learn what it was like as an American Christian woman to interact with Muslim men, to have them as drivers and translators and things like that. And then one day it suddenly occurred to me, I was taken away from some Muslim men I wanted to interview and taken to lunch with the women because I had to eat with the women. And I was pretty resentful of that to begin with, because I was not going to get to talk to the important people. And then I had this beautiful lunch where I learned so much about what these women's lives were like. And I suddenly realized I had this incredible privilege of being a woman, being a mother, and being able to enter into family life with people in these situations. And along the same lines, I would go to the U.S. military was doing press briefings in the green zone of Baghdad every day. And you go to these press briefings and learn nothing. And if you ask someone in the green zone about like the craters that U.S. bombs had created in the streets of Baghdad, is there a plan for fixing these people? This is an advanced society here where they have sewer and water. And I'm staying with a family out in Baghdad that has no water, no sewer, and is now dealing with 3 hours a day of electricity. And people in the green zone didn't know about these things. Mm-hmm. And I had a moment where I left the green zone and thought, I'm not going back. And so all to say that my focus became not so much what the headliners were doing in the middle of these conflicts, but how the people were surviving, how they were continuing to live. And I think about that a lot as a really important, privileged perspective that I had because, since that time, we've all experienced a pandemic. Mm-hmm. We've all experienced some of the conflict in the world. We've all experienced some terrorism and violence and things like that. And this is a part of life in a broken and fallen world. And so learning from women, from men, from children, incredible resilience in the face of terrible breakdowns is something that I just consider a real privilege of my work.
Right. It is an extraordinary thing to imagine that array that you've just painted so swiftly and clearly about the devastation again and again and again and again and again in all these different settings that you've been exposed to. And while I know you were doing your job as a professional journalist and that you were capable, partly, I imagine, through that, to be able to cope with all of that you were seeing because you were there as a professional reporter, feeling a responsibility to tell the stories. But how did you cope with the trauma of exposure that you were having? And how does that still affect or not affect you as you go to these various places?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a tender question. I think that I did have a lot of good training. and a lot of good support for the most part on these trips. And that would allow me, I had a pretty strong, especially in the early days, strong idea of my job was to be a witness for those who couldn't be there. And so that gives you a certain responsibility to stand up and be brave.
Yes.
In Sudan, probably around 1999 or 2000, we went into a village. I was with a local Sudanese NGO, and they knew that there were people who had just fled some fighting. It was a village I wasn't planning to go to. I didn't know anything about. They didn't know what we were going to find there. When we got there, we found people starving. We found people who were holding their babies, scooping up water from a just barely a puddle in a gourd and dripping water into their babies' mouths. And the photographer who I had taken with me on this day said, I think you need to come over here. And there was a tiny child. Turned out the mother said she was 3 years old, but she looked like she was about 6 months old, who was lying on a blanket and just, sort of like a tiny bird you could see every bone in her body. And they had laid her down because there was nothing more they could do for her. And she died of starvation that evening. It was a very hard thing. The photographer and I looked at each other and I said, take photos. And I began trying to talk to the mother. And it was a very, very hard and challenging thing. But those photos went on the cover of our magazine at the time. It's I think the first time, maybe the only time I've gotten a call from the State Department asking me for the coordinates of where I was, because it was a place that was very hard to find on any map. And there were actually supplies flown into this area because that camp, we were just seeing that, a spontaneous camp. And that camp by the next week had tens of thousands of people in it. And many of them there was a terrible outbreak of measles there. And so there were groups that were actually able to get supplies flown in and to help them. But those are things that don't leave you. And I think that for Americans, we always get to walk away. I'm really aware in whatever hard situation I'm in, there's a little voice at the back of my brain that's saying, don't forget, you get to go home.
Mindy, thank you for giving us such a vivid sense of what your journey and your experience and your heart work, as well as your head work and your public work and your writing work all involves. I want to turn to this question of PEPFAR, and you've published just recently a really helpful summary of what's going on with PEPFAR because of the administration's decisions about ending PEPFAR support and Congress failing to act on the PEPFAR proposals that were before them. So I'd like you to just very briefly summarize again what PEPFAR is, how significant it has been in its help, and what the meaning of this sudden abandonment of our commitments is going to cause.
PEPFAR is the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which was passed by Congress, instigated, I should say, by President George W. Bush in 2003. At what I think many people would call the height of a global pandemic in HIV/AIDS prevalence, HIV/AIDS deaths, et cetera. And in the time that the program has been around, it was an incredible lift. It authorized up to about $5 billion a year in funds that would be used to treat HIV/AIDS across the globe in about 50 to 60 countries. That varied year by year. I think what's really significant, it was the first time that the United States had committed this kind of funding to battling a single disease. It was trend-setting in that it strengthened the UN programs that were battling AIDS. It strengthened European programs that were battling AIDS. It also put a level of just elevated the platform to the degree that it became a healthcare priority around the world. And keep in mind that AIDS had become something that was almost 100% fatal. So there was And as antiretroviral drugs came on the scene that were not curing the disease, but were suppressing the virus to the point that people no longer experienced the kinds of symptoms that were leading toward usually death that would often come from other things, from secondary things. And the drugs were suppressing the viral load. And once that happened, it quit spreading quite as fast as it normally would. So this is just to give you an idea of the level of complexity. And so this is something that has come to a point. I mean, we know that in the area of fighting epidemic, pandemic type diseases, that when we stop talking about them, then we must be doing something right. And I think until the move by the Trump administration, most people probably didn't think about. Few people would know what PEPFAR was. They weren't thinking about the fact that the United States was underwriting this global program. But keep in mind, we still don't have a real cure for HIV. And therefore, we are in this situation of constantly having people on medications that will suppress the ability of it to translate into a deadly disease and the ability of it to spread widely through populations. And so this is a kind of heavy lift program that has continued since that time. And the complexity is, I mean, I'm struggling to figure out how to even explain what the dismantling does, because the dismantling, when the Trump administration began slashing contracts that it had with its partners where these funds were going around the world, it was done entirely indiscriminately. And we had the total shutdown of USAID itself, the agency where many of the funds, but PEPFAR was a wide-ranging program. I mean, some of the funding went through the State Department, USAID, some went through HHS, some even went through the Department of Defense. I mean, this was just the kind of program that it was. And suddenly you had almost all of it pulled back. And I would also go back, and I should have said this at the beginning, to say that Congress had reauthorized this program multiple times, I believe 4, but I'm not 100% sure on that. But they had revisited it. They had shown oversight over it. There had been hearings, and increasingly, whereas in the beginning this was a program that conservatives and liberals were largely on board with because it had something in it for each one of them, over time, it became something that conservatives were challenging. And they did so because they were saying that it was not pro-life enough, was the latest. There was a real reauthorization battle in 2023. But it did pass, and it passed after extensive oversight by Congress. So in this, it's important to say that, because right now the situation you have is that the Trump administration has basically shuttered the program, and they have done so without the oversight of Congress, without revisiting this in any way. And Congress, as we have seen since President Trump took office, has shown no interest in exercising oversight. A reauthorization deadline came 2 weeks ago, and it came and went. And there was no agenda item in Congress to take this up and to in any way reauthorize it or move forward with some kind of orderly closure. The medical issues are very complex because you have 20 million people who are currently taking antiretroviral drugs that are funded under PEPFAR. And most of those people just suddenly could not have access to their medicine. And that means that we are watching even now the disease grow. And that's going to be different. Wherever you are, it's going to look different. I think Nick Kristof in the New York Times wrote about a young man who, even though he was on the drugs, was still very sick. And soon after coming off of them, he died. And so the calculation, I did look at several different sources, and they all agree that the death toll from this decision and the shuttering of the clinics and the funds that support them within a year's time could be 1.6 million people.
I'm Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me. That number is just staggering. That's more than the number of people who have died in U.S. military conflicts since World War II, including World War II, up to today. We have lost fewer people than this 1.6 million in 1 year through HIV/AIDS deaths. It has to be said, and important for anyone that's taking this up seriously, of course, no one is against the idea of government evaluation and of appropriate discipline and of self-regulation, that where there's violations of anything, all of that needs to be called into question and set right, even in relationship to the charges that supposedly PEPFAR funds are being used to fund abortions. As far as I'm understanding, there was one instance of that. It came to knowledge through the very mechanisms built into PEPFAR that called it out, that corrected the circumstances, that repaid the funds. And it's not an established fact at all that there is rampant use of funds beyond the original intention, of course, of PEPFAR treating HIV/AIDS patients.
Right.
So the devastation, the scale of the devastation is really quite mind-bending. And furthermore, it's also really difficult to figure out, and here's where I'm hoping you can give us at least some of your perspective and suggestions. It's very hard to figure out what people who care about this can actually do in this time. They can certainly write to their congressman, representative, and explain how important the issue is, and hoping that the PEPFAR matter will be revisited, et cetera. And there is, I suppose, a theoretical possibility that's going to happen. It seems very doubtful that that's what's going to happen, especially when it's part of the shutting down of USAID in general, and already the decimation that this has caused to a lot of clinics. But what can we do? I mean, I think your Substack article does a great job of distilling the critical issues that are involved in the numbers of people that are being touched. What now, Mindy, when you think about this situation? What are the pathways forward?
Yeah, I think the what now question is the extremely difficult one. And it's not only, doesn't only affect the PEPFAR program and people who are living with HIV right now around the world. It affects many of the issues that we're seeing where agencies are suddenly shuttered, where deportations seem to be happening at a rate above and beyond criminal cases, which is what we were led to believe would be the initial targets. So I think that there are like two running levels for answering this question. And the first is, yes, I think it is helpful to be contacting members of Congress, elected officials, the healthcare committee, the health oversight committees, and that sort of thing. And I think also we all know candidly that seems to be of little value. We have Congress that just is not exercising its own proper oversight responsibilities right now. But I want to think that we're maybe not even in the middle of something. We're maybe just at the beginning of something. And I think we all have to figure out how we work through the long-term battle that we are in around how we do government, how we do information, how we sort through the role of government. And one of the things that people will say about, and so there's a lot of education and a lot of conversation that has to happen. And those things can happen at our dinner tables. They can happen with our neighbors. They can happen with our local officials too. My own congressman, my own Republican congressman was one of, I think, 2 or 3 who held a town hall over the last couple of months. And that was a very useful forum for bringing up all kinds of issues, and this would be one of them. I simply think that in the sea of all of these changes, government changes that we're seeing right now, we all have to decide which are the ones that, and I as a journalist have to decide which are the ones that are critical. And as I saw this 1.6 million figure and then heard the physician researcher at Johns Hopkins, who I quote in the article, give this astonishing picture of it, it made it a critical issue for me. And he said, if a person is entrusted to care for a building and decides to tear it down, there's a moral imperative to disclose whether there are people inside. there are 20.6 million people and 566,000 children living inside PEPFAR. And that, again, just to underscore the magnitude of it, and then to begin to have what may feel like they're not conversations or actions that are going to have immediate effect, but for all of us to understand as Americans, what is the role of our government? Is it a government of the people, by the people, and for the people? And therefore, do I know what I need to know to be a good citizen, to be in that conversation? And I think that most of us are finding, I think most Americans, I had the privilege of being in Africa, and I've seen the PEPFAR, I've seen the bad side of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, but I've also seen PEPFAR working and working incredibly routinely and in life-saving ways. Most people don't get to see that, but we need to know about it. I see these comments, even comments to the story that I posted. Well, the U.S. can't be doing charity. Well, what's charity? And it's such an overstatement to just simply call this charity. This is about raising the level of good health around the world, and that has economic value, that has national security value. And I dare say that many of the people who are saying these things could not have told you what PEPFAR was 2 weeks ago. And so I think we all are being forced to be pulled out of a kind of an urgent chasing the tail of a dragon kind of mindset, and taking steps back and being more thoughtful in how we approach these issues and how we talk about them is to me maybe feels not doing enough, but it is where we have to begin.
Well, I think you're right. That is, I think, given the circumstances that we're facing on this front and on many other fronts, it's about a long and agonizing process of conversational change and of a place for understanding a moral conscience by America in relationship to the wider world. And certainly God doesn't need the United States of America, and God's compassion and mercy and justice sometimes intersects with life in America, and it sometimes doesn't, depending on who you are and what color of skin and what gender you may be and what your sexual orientation may be. All these things are things that I believe God cares very deeply about. And yet, certainly as a nation, among nations, the thought that we want to be a moral nation suggests to me that we are needing to call our nation not to a Christian identity, which I think is the false attempt of Christian nationalism, but to a moral identity that people of faith, little faith, no faith, other faiths can enter into and share. And I think some element of that has been operational in the United States for a very long time. And now all of that is being dismantled and being labeled, as you say, by a really cheap word like charity, as though there's no wider frame than simply compassionate sentimentality, as opposed to something that's really taking the moral realities of the world and all of their urgency seriously. And not pretending that we need to be, as we've sometimes tried to be as a nation, the healer of the nations, but to say that we should actually be the a force for taking these issues with great national seriousness and not just repudiating it because it's not inside the boundaries of our own country.
One of the things that's really unique about this particular program, too, the PEPFAR program, is that I think one of the reasons that so many were on board with it in the beginning is that it was seeking to do something quite novel at the time, which was to use the influence and the economic force of the United States to fund local programs. And so the genius was that distribution of drugs would happen not in some nationwide campaign, because that was going to be unworkable,
Right.
but by locating in the specific areas where the HIV/AIDS prevalence rate was highest, locating local clinics and in many cases local NGOs that included churches, and there were significant, one of the first of the PEPFAR funded sites that the First Lady, Laura Bush, and I believe the president too visited was in Uganda. And it was a church-run site. And so you've had this incredible partnership. And I think that is sort of harnessing what you're talking about, the aspect of flourishing and plenitude that is the United States. And I feel like we've lost that. I feel like we're having these conversations as though we're not the wealthiest nation in the world, as though we're not the most undertaxed nation in the world, as though we're not the one of the freest economies in the world, where we can make these choices and say, we have the resources to go and make a difference in this situation. And by doing that, we set an example for others to do it. And there has been this long trajectory of PEPFAR moving resources into local communities. And by bringing those people along, training new levels of healthcare workers, it's like a 5-year, there were all these goals set up for 2030, at which point they would be turning lots of this program over to local authorities. And at that point, the U.S. allocations of funding for PEPFAR have been flat for over a decade. You could argue that they're a lot, but on the scale of what healthcare programs cost, and a program of this scale, $5 billion a year in 50-some countries is not a lot. And it had been flat. It had never gone up. And it would probably be starting to scale back after 2030, but with success. And I feel like we have adopted an attitude of scarcity and pulling in and not seeing ourselves as people who are able and equipped to give hope and to give real healing to other parts of the world. And I think it will do something to us that we have become this way.
It was a number of years ago, before PEPFAR, that I made a trip to Uganda. And while I was there, I was visiting people with HIV/AIDS, among others. And about 2 or 3 years later, I was back in the same village and meeting with a group of people as I had done in the previous trip. And I didn't realize, and they deliberately kept it from me, that the people in this one group were the same people that I had met pre-antiretroviral drugs.
Mm.
And I had pictures in my mind, which I'd kept vividly in front of me, of what that first group looked like. Mm-hmm. And when I came into the second group, these were not those people, because the earlier people were really in the process of dying, and you could just visually see this. And I remember them being so astonished that, for example, that my colleague and close friend, David Zach Neringier, and I went around and shook everyone's hands and prayed for them. They were surprised that had happened, because at the time there was still that skittishness around how HIV transmission actually happens. So when I came back 3 years later, and they had all had the benefit of antiretroviral drugs, and they were all the same people. And I held up the picture that I happened to have with me, and it was the same crowd, but their life had been given back to them. It was just
That's amazing.
It was just an unbelievable contrast. So part of what I think I experience emotionally in this time is just the taste that I've seen directly in so many places in the United States, I will say, as well as in places internationally, for the impact of these drugs and how it really is back from the jaws of death that people are being aided by these drugs, and to suddenly cut them off is just really, really an act of cruelty. And even if it was thought to be necessary, with no runway of a declining anticipation of this happening at a certain date and with certain planning and other things,
right,
we would just have a radically different moment. But that's not what's happening. It's just off with everyone's heads in one fell swoop. And it just seems extraordinary.
Yeah. And I do think, there are a lot of conversations around who can step in the gap. And yes, churches and civic organizations can step in the gap. Yes, foundations can provide antiretroviral drugs. But I think two things about this is just understanding that this is a system we're not talking about. It's not just medications, and that the system has already become, the wheels are already off of the system. They begin to come off the minute that the funding stopped, because the funding comes through on a constant basis that makes these things possible. The reimbursements come through. So there's that. But the other thing is the question of how we would, I mean, I don't think that the question can be taken off of the government here, and the accountability and the oversight issue here is that if we are suddenly saving $5 billion a year or something close to it, where's that going? What's it going to be used for? And those are the questions that we just are not getting answers to right now. And again, the oversight responsibility of Congress comes into really serious question here, because if these things are all happening by executive decision and Congress does not have a meaningful role, then essentially the people are cut out of the conversation. And we don't know where the money, we once knew where the money was going, but we don't know where it's going right now, even the money that we allegedly are saving. And so there are just real and serious questions, even if we see that many people will step up and that in some places these programs will be able to continue. The State Department did reverse itself, as it has on a number of these development type grants and disbursements, and they did reinstate some hospitals, some clinics that are doing, I know one that treats 5,000 HIV patients, but many of them are still have gone away, and they have gone away, it sounds like, for good, or at least for this period of time. And then there will be the rollback in terms of health that will affect other things, because HIV is people who become sicker with HIV will become more likely to have tuberculosis, more likely to be suffering from other diseases and side effects of the virus itself.
Right. Which is how most HIV deaths occur. Yeah, it's an extraordinary story. Mindy, this is a big question for anyone, so I'm not laying this at you because I think you'll have some cosmic answer to this. But I know that many people who are suffering with the suffering of many other people right now are just wondering, where is the hand of God in this, or where is God helping us in this? How would you respond to that question?
Yeah, it's hard to see where the hand of God is in it. And I think we can be honest about that we just don't see where the hand of God is in it. And then I also, I go back to what we talked about at the top here about just seeing incredible resilience of other people. And I think this is a real time. I am learning so much from the stories of perseverance of many communities in the United States and abroad. The perseverance of the African American community in the United States for centuries under slavery, under Jim Crow laws, under just incredible pressure and terrible oppression. The way in which African communities have faced poverty and have learned to care for one another and have cared for one another in sickness and in terrible situations of war and hunger is also something that we can learn from. The communities that I've seen in the Middle East that have suffered terribly from the wars of recent years, and the way in which they just keep on leaning into one another. There's a wonderful a wonderful NGO that runs schools in Iraq, and they've been there for just decades. And at the height of the war, their slogan was, "It's a dangerous world, go anyway." And I love that, because I think it's a dangerous time right now. It's a very unsettling time. And we have to, on some level, just know that, well, God is in this because other people have been through hard times and other times, and they saw the hand of God. But when we don't see the hand of God, then we just have to go anyway. And we have to trust that the hand of God is there and that it will meet us in the midst of those hard situations.
Amen. Thank you, Mindy, for being our guest on Conversing today. And thank you for following this story and continuing to lift it before us. I hope that anyone who's listened to this will, again, visit Mindy's Substack and her recent article about the 1.65 million people that are at risk because of cutting off PEPFAR support. This has been an important conversation, an urgent question and concern, and just an example of the kind of investigative journalism that we really need to hear the most important stories. And surely this has got to be one of the most important ones. Thank you again very much for being here.
Thank you, Mark.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.